She thought she was marrying a failure. She was wrong. The year was 1885. In the small Appalachian town of Greenvale, nestled between rolling mountains and whispering pine forests, everyone knew everyone and everyone had an opinion about Clara Whitfield's choices. Clara was 22 years old, with chestnut hair that caught the afternoon light like copper, and green eyes that held a kind of quiet intelligence most men in Greenvale found unsettling. Her father, Edmund Whitfield, owned the only general store in town. That made Clara, by local standards, a woman of considerable standing. She could have married the banker's son. She could have accepted the proposal of Deputy Marshal Holt, who had asked her twice already, and would have asked a third time, had she given him the slightest encouragement. Instead, she fell in love with a man who came down from the mountain with dirt on his boots and calluses on his hands and not a single coin to his name. His name was Elias Craw. Nobody knew much about Elias. He had appeared in Greenvale one spring morning, about a year before their story truly began, asking for work at the lumber yard. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and grey eyes that seemed to be permanently fixed on some distant horizon only he could see. He spoke little. He worked hard. He ate alone. On Sundays, instead of attending church with the rest of the town, he disappeared back up into the mountains, returning Monday morning without explanation. People talked, as people in small towns always do. Some said he was hiding from something. Some said he had escaped from a prison out west. Old Mrs. Hatch, who prided herself on knowing everything about everybody, declared with absolute certainty that he was a drifter with no family and no future, and that any woman who gave him her heart would find herself sleeping on a dirt floor before the year was out. Clara heard all of it, and she watched Elias anyway. She watched how he helped a young boy retrieve a wagon wheel that had rolled into the creek, refusing payment and walking away before the father could even offer thanks. She watched how he gave half his lunch to a stray dog every single day without fail. She noticed that when the foreman at the lumber yard shouted at the workers, every man flinched except Elias, not because he was hardened or cruel, but because he seemed to carry a deep, unshakable calm that the world's noise could not disturb. She did not fall in love with him because of what he had. She fell in love with him because of what he was. Their first real conversation happened in October, when an early frost had dusted the mountain peaks white and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming winter. Clara had been walking along the creek path returning from her friend Nora's house when she heard the sound, a low, desperate whimpering coming from the brush near the water's edge. She pushed through the bracken and found Elias kneeling over an injured fox, its front leg caught in a rusted trap that some careless hunter had left behind. The animal was terrified, snapping weakly at the air, too exhausted to do more, and Elias was talking to it. Low, soft words, not commands, not hushing sounds. Actual words, patient and gentle, as though the fox might understand if he just explained clearly enough what he intended to do. Clara stood completely still and watched him work the trap open with careful, unhurried hands, his voice never stopping. Those grey eyes locked on the animal's amber ones. When the fox was free, it lay trembling for a long moment, and then, impossibly, it pressed its nose briefly to Elias's hand before disappearing into the forest. Elias stood and turned and found Clara watching him. He did not look embarrassed to be caught speaking tenderly to a wild animal. He simply looked at her the way he looked at everything, with that quiet, measuring calm. "You're Edmund Whitfield's daughter," he said, "and you're the man nobody knows anything about," she replied. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, something deeper than that. "That's mostly true," he said, and walked back toward town. She thought about him for 3 days straight after that. By December, they were meeting at the creek path deliberately, though neither of them would have called it courting, not yet. They talked about everything and nothing. He asked her about books, and she was surprised to find he had read more than anyone she knew, though he named no school and no teacher. She asked him about the mountains, and his answers were so precise and loving in their detail that she felt she was seeing those peaks through new eyes. He did not tell her where he came from. She did not push. By February, he had asked her father for permission to court her. Edmund Whitfield's reaction was exactly what the town would have predicted. He sat behind the counter of his general store, looked Elias Craw up and down the worn coat. Plain boots, the absence of a hat held respectfully in hand because he owned no hat worth holding, and said with the kind of measured cruelty that careful men use like a scalpel, "What exactly do you intend to offer my daughter, Mr. Craw?" Elias did not flinch. Myself, he said honestly and completely. Edmund told him to leave. Clara, who had been listening from the stockroom doorway, came out before Elias had reached the door. Papa, she said quietly, I am going to walk with Mr. Craw. I will be back before dark. Her father did not speak to her for 4 days. The town naturally had opinions. Nora, her dearest friend, held her hands and spoke with genuine worry. Clara, I love you, and I am telling you as your friend he has nothing. What will you live on? Love doesn't fill a stomach in January. The banker's wife stopped her on the street to deliver the same message in considerably less kind terms. Even Reverend Moore took a Sunday to preach a sermon about the virtue of wisdom in matters of the heart that was so transparently directed at Clara that several members of the congregation turned to look at her. Clara smiled politely at all of them and kept walking with Elias on Sunday afternoons. In April, he asked her to marry him. They were sitting on a flat boulder above the creek, watching the meltwater run fast and silver below, when he turned to her with an expression she had never seen on him before, not the usual calm, but something raw and exposed. The look of a man who has decided to step off a ledge and is doing it anyway. I know what people say about me, he began. I don't listen to what people say, she told him. You should know something before I ask you what I'm about to ask you. He paused, and she saw the muscle in his jaw work once. I have not been honest with you. Not dishonest, I haven't lied. But there are things I haven't said, things I should have said. He looked at the water. I have a reason for going up the mountain on Sundays. I have had a reason all along. He looked back at her. Will you trust me for a little while longer? Will you let me show you instead of tell you? She searched his face. The openness there, the vulnerability of a man who had spent a long time building walls and was now deliberately, stone by stone, taking them down was more convincing than any explanation could have been. Ask me what you were going to ask me, she said. Marry me, Clara, and let me take you home. She said yes. The wedding was small. Her father came, because in the end Edmund Whitfield loved his daughter more than he loved being right, though it clearly cost him something to sit in that little church, watching her place her hand in the hand of a man with no apparent prospects. Nora cried. Deputy Marshal Holt sat in the back row with an expression like a man attending a funeral. The banker's wife did not come at all, which Clara considered a wedding gift. Elias had rented a small room above the feed store for the 2 weeks preceding the wedding. The night they were married, Clara packed her belongings, 3 dresses, her books, her mother's silver hairbrush into a traveling bag, and Elias came to collect her in the early morning, before the town was awake. He came with a horse she had never seen before. A beautiful animal, dark bay with a white star on its forehead, clearly well kept and well bred. Not the kind of horse a lumber-yard worker could afford. She looked at the horse. She looked at Elias. She asked no questions. They rode up the mountain road together, Clara on the horse and Elias walking alongside, and then, when the road ended, continuing on a trail that wound up through pine and beech and dense green shadow. The morning was cool and bright, birds loud in the canopy above, and Clara's heart was doing something complicated in her chest, not fear, exactly, but the particular feeling of standing at the edge of something unknown and irreversible. They climbed for nearly 2 hours, and then the trees opened up. The house sat in a natural clearing on a south-facing slope, where the mountain gently fell into a wide, meadowed shelf overlooking the valley far below. Clara pulled the horse to a stop and simply stared. It was not a mansion in the way that word is typically understood, no marble columns, no European pretension. But it was magnificent in the way that honest craftsmanship on a grand scale is always magnificent. 3 stories of local stone and dark timber, with wide porches wrapping the lower level, tall windows that caught the morning sun and turned it to gold. A garden that had gone somewhat wild, but showed, in its bones, the plan of someone who had known what they were doing when they planted it. A stone wall enclosed a kitchen garden to one side. A stable, solidly built, stood to the other. From somewhere behind the house came the sound of water, a spring running clear. Clara sat on that horse for a long moment without speaking. My grandfather built it, Elias said from beside her, his voice careful and quiet. His name was Samuel Craw. He came to this mountain in 1831 with nothing but a mule and a plan, and he spent 30 years building what you're looking at. My father was born here. I was born here. He paused. When my father died, 7 years ago, I inherited all of it. The house, the land, about 400 acres in total. Some of it is timbered, some farmed, some wild. Clara turned to look at him. Why? She said, with remarkable steadiness for a woman whose world had just rearranged itself. "Did you not tell me this?" He met her gaze. The exposure she had seen in him at the creek was back, and now she understood it better. This was a man who had been burned before by someone, and had learned a particular kind of caution that had nothing to do with cowardice. "I needed to know," he said simply, "that you were choosing me, not this." He gestured at the house, the land, the morning light, turning everything beautiful. "I spent 2 years in Richmond after my father died. I was known there the Craw estate, the Craw fortune. Women were kind to me, very kind. And not one of them looked at me the way you looked at me when you thought I was nobody. The silence between them held something enormous and fragile. You tested me," she said at last. "I let the truth test you," he corrected gently. "You saw a man the town called worthless. You kept choosing him anyway. That's that to me everything I needed to know." She was quiet for another moment. Then she climbed down from the horse, walked to him, and took his face between her hands. "Elias Craw," she said, "you are the most complicated, simple man I have ever met." And for the first time in all the months she had known him, she saw him smile, a real smile, unguarded and wide, the smile of someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has finally been given permission to breathe. He carried her across the threshold of the house, which smelled of pine resin and old wood and dried lavender, and she walked from room to room in the morning light, touching things gently, the stone fireplace tall enough to stand in, the kitchen with its long oak table, the shelves of books in the study, hundreds of them, more than she had ever seen outside of a city. She ran her finger along their spines, like greeting old friends. "Your books," she said. "Our books," he said from the doorway. For afternoon, they sat together on the wide porch and looked out over the valley. Greenvale was visible far below, tiny and distant, its church steeple a small white needle against the green. Clara thought about her father in his store, about Nora worrying over empty stomachs, about the banker's wife and Deputy Holt, and all the voices that had catalogued Elias's inadequacies with such confident precision. None of them had known, not one. "Are you angry with me?" Elias asked. She genuinely, honestly, the way she considered everything. "I think," she said slowly, "that I understand why you did it. I think I might have done something similar if I were you and had been hurt in the way you were hurt." She glanced at him. "You will tell me about Richmond." It wasn't a question. He nodded. "I will tell you everything." And he did. That evening by the fire, the story of a woman named Genevieve, who had loved the estate and not the man, who had shown him with crystalline clarity the difference between being desired and being loved, and who had left when she understood there were conditions attached to the inheritance that made it less immediately liquid than she had imagined. He spoke without bitterness, which Clara found more moving than bitterness would have been. He had processed the pain. He had learned from it. He had simply, carefully, refused to let it make him into someone smaller. The weeks that followed were a discovery, layer by layer, of a life more full and more interesting than Clara had imagined possible. Elias was not a man of idle wealth. The estate ran on work, constant and satisfying work, and he worked it himself with the same quiet diligence he had shown at the lumber yard. There were tenants on part of the land, families who farmed and paid a modest rent, and Elias knew all their names, their children's names, the particular difficulties of each piece of ground they worked. He was building something, he explained to Clara, not cast, maintaining what his grandfather had made, but expanding it thoughtfully, carefully, in a way that would last. Clara threw herself into it with the whole force of her considerable intelligence. She reorganized the household accounts within a month, identifying 3 areas where they were losing money unnecessarily, and 2 opportunities that Elias had not considered. He looked at her revised ledgers with an expression of pure delight. "You should have been running a business," he told her. "Oh," she said pleasantly, and kept writing. In June, her father came up the mountain. Edmund Whitfield made the 2-hour climb on foot, arriving at the clearing breathing hard and looking around him with an expression that moved through several stages in quick succession: astonishment, calculation, a complicated guilt, and finally something that resolved, painfully, into simple love for his daughter. Clara met him on the porch steps. They stood facing each other. He looked older than he had at the wedding. She thought that uncertainty and pride together wear a man faster than hardship does. "I owe you an apology," he said. It clearly cost him something. "And I owe him one." "Come inside, Papa," she said. "Elias has been asking when you would visit." The look on her father's face at that, at the understanding that the man he had dismissed so contemptuously had not dismissed him in return. had instead simply waited with patience for this moment, was something Clara would remember for the rest of her life. Elias shook Edmund's hand without ceremony or point-making, showed him the house and the land with the quiet pride of a man who has built something worth showing. And by the time Edmund sat down to dinner at that long oak table, the thing between them had been quietly, irrevocably repaired. Edmund stayed for 3 days. On the morning he left, he held his daughter for a long time without speaking, and when he finally stepped back, his eyes were bright. "You always did see more clearly than the rest of us," he said. "I should have trusted that." "You came," she told him. "That's what matters." She stood on the porch and watched him make his way back down the mountain trail until the trees took him. And then she stood there a while longer in the morning quiet, listening to the spring run behind the house and the wind move through the pines, and somewhere above her, an eagle calling, high and clean. Elias came to stand beside her. She felt his hand find hers. "Happy?" he asked. She looked at the valley below, at the mountains around them, at the sky above, that enormous Appalachian sky that in late summer goes so blue it seems almost too vivid to be real. She thought about all the versions of this life she might have lived: the banker's son, Deputy Holt, the careful, predictable life her town had imagined for her. She thought about a man talking gently to a terrified fox in the October bracken, certain that patience and honesty were worth more than noise. "Ask me something harder," she said. His laugh, the real laugh, the one she had been working all these months to unlock, came out into the mountain air and disappeared into the trees. And the eagle called again overhead, and the spring ran clear over the stones behind the house that Samuel Craw had built with his hands in 1831. And Clara Whitfield, who was Clara Craw now and had been right about everything, turned to her husband and smiled, like a woman who has never once regretted the road she chose, not because the road was easy, but because it led here. And that was always what mattered. That was always what she had known.